One of the big learnings for me over the years has been the change in focus. And when I would have started working with the organisation, would have been 8 years ago, it was very much focused on the person living with MND, to the exclusion of others. And that's something we have worked hard to change, because MND isn't just something that comes into a house and sits in a person. It is something that comes into a house and causes a hurricane. And the people who are around the patient need as much support many times as the patient themselves, because they are living the same experience but differently. So our next speaker is going to talk a little bit about that. So if you know somebody who has been recently diagnosed, or someone who's in the middle of the experience or part of that journey, there are many people, sadly, who will be finding out in the next few months that they're about to start on that journey. Our next speaker hopefully will give some insight to this. To talk about how will MND affect my family, would you please welcome psychologist in clinical training at the University of Limerick, Dr Sile Carney. Sheila, good morning.
Good morning.
Lovely to talk to you. We can see your screen, so I will throw it over to you. You have the bones of 20 minutes. I'll give you a 5-minute warning. Thank you, Sheila.
Perfect. I'm just going to check in. Can everyone see the slideshow now?
We can indeed, yeah.
Perfect. That's grand. Okay, so firstly, I suppose just to start, to say thank you very much for inviting me to come today. Or I suppose to speak today. I know how valuable this weekend is for people, so just to apologise for my absence in person, and yeah, without further ado, I'll get started. So this talk is really about, I suppose, how to maybe begin the conversation with your loved ones after the diagnosis of motor neuron disease. So my father didn't get a diagnosis of motor neuron disease, our whole family did. And that's that theme has come up for me over the past couple of years in my research and working with people with motor neuron disease. It affects everyone in the house. It affects everyone in the, as Miriam spoke about, the wider ecosystem. And everyone can process the news very differently. The individual who gets the diagnosis, the spouse or the family member or the friend who maybe accompanies them, and then as we start to share the news or share the diagnosis with loved ones, each one of those will also have a different reaction, and they'll have a different, I suppose, where I might kick in to speed of saying, okay, we need to get this sorted, we need to get the next thing sorted. Another person might say, no, I'm not going to talk about this. I do not need, I don't need to talk about it because nothing's going to change. So two very different responses, but both very normal and very natural. So it's important, I suppose, as we share the news, to maybe expect different responses. So just because one person might respond in one way doesn't mean that the next person will. And while I suppose you might get a diagnosis of motor neuron disease, it's likely that the people around you have already started maybe wondering little things, or maybe have noticed little changes. So often, I suppose, sharing the news with them, while it can be really difficult to start the conversation, it can be the answer to a big unspoken worry for your loved one. So I suppose I wouldn't be afraid of sharing the news in that sense, because it can help your loved ones as well kind of understand what's been happening. So after the diagnosis of motor neuron disease, and thinking about how it's going to affect yourself, it's normal then to start thinking about, how am I going to actually begin to even talk about this to my loved ones? How will it change the relationships within my family? How will it change my relationship with my friends? And initially it might be easier for yourself to come to terms with the diagnosis by going to talk to a healthcare professional. And this might be easier because it provides the space, I suppose, to express your worries, your fears to somebody outside of the family, and somebody who may understand and know about the illness and the shock that can occur after the initial diagnosis, but also it can somebody who might know about the kind of changes that occur and the different stages of it. And some people find kind of talking to somebody outside the family is just easier in that kind of processing stage, getting to terms with the diagnosis. You may not feel ready to talk about the diagnosis with the people close to you, and that's where that talking to a healthcare professional can be really useful. And then other people may not want to talk about it at all, because that's, I suppose, when it might the fear might come in that it'll all become very real. But I suppose whatever you feel or think, it's important to remember that it's a very normal reaction. And I suppose you might talk to different people over this weekend, and people might, discuss their own reactions to the diagnosis. And it's important to remember that as you listen, you'll probably hear, 10, 15, 20 different responses. And it goes to show, I suppose, our own individuality. But there can be some things that you can do to support yourself within that process. And one of those things are to include your friends and family in the illness, and that's to let them know what's happening. It can be really useful in trying to decide how to discuss it. It can be really useful to bring a healthcare professional into that to that conversation. So whether or not you want to be there for it or not, maybe it's one of the IMNDA nurses are visiting the house. It could be an idea to invite some of your close friends and family, to the kitchen table when the nurse is there, and you can either facilitate that by organising it, but you don't necessarily have to be there for it, or you can be there, and people can have kind of an open conversation and ask the questions that they need to ask, that they may not want to ask you yourself, even though you're the person going through it and have the answers around the experience that you're currently having. But sometimes it can be difficult for either you, the person who has the diagnosis, or for your loved one to be there for that conversation. So that can be it can be a nice idea to bring in a healthcare professional just to kind of facilitate that. I suppose you're in control of how much information you want to share, how much you want to tell people, and when you want to tell them. And taking charge of this can really help. But I suppose it can be really useful to start this process early after the diagnosis. I suppose giving yourself time to process the information, but also to be available to maybe help support your family through it as well. I know there can be that sense of wanting to protect your family and your loved ones, and keeping the kind of illness to yourself and trying to always put your best foot forward. But that can be really difficult to do, especially if you're just having a bad day. It can be really hard to, I suppose, kind of keep the bright side out. So by including your family members, including your friends, then you can have kind of open and honest conversations, and you can say, yeah, today isn't a great day, but tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow's a new day. And also, I suppose, as I've already mentioned, your family members and friends, the people closest to you, may have already started to notice some things. They may have already started to see little changes. So they may already be expecting something, and by including them can really be a relief, as it can kind of, I suppose, equip them to help support you, and also that they can get support themselves. So in terms of, I suppose, discussing with our young children, family counsellors recommend that telling children about serious news, to do it as soon as possible and in a very age-appropriate way. So if we're thinking about the young children in our lives, these might be our own children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews. It can be difficult, I suppose, to even know where to begin or how to even address it. And you may want, again, that kind of support of a close family member or a healthcare professional to help kind of facilitate that conversation. And it can also be really useful to kind of have it clear in your own head, okay, well, how much am I going to share here, and what exactly am I going to say? You may want to protect your children from the illness, but that doesn't necessarily, I suppose, help your child. Your child is likely to have already maybe noticed some things that may be happening. Maybe they've noticed that you're going to more appointments, or people are picking them up after school if you're not able to collect them because of an appointment, and things like that. So they might be already noticing little things. And yourselves, kids are very, very sharp. So it's important, I suppose, give them credit where they're due. There's no right or wrong way to tell your children. But I suppose doing it in a kind of an open way, and giving them space to process the information that you're telling them. And I suppose they don't need a whole lot of information about the specifics, but they may need, I suppose, a space that's familiar to them, that they feel safe in, that they can ask a question openly without having to kind of worry about who's in their surroundings, and that they're not rushing out the door to somebody. So it's really important that when you're having this conversation with young people, that it's not maybe at breakfast in the morning when they're, have to run out the door or running out the door to train, and that there's enough time to process the information, maybe go away to their bedroom, take some time, and then come back with any questions that they might have. It's really important, I suppose, to answer questions as truthfully as possible, and it is okay to say you don't have the answers. But they'll know then that if they come and ask a question in the future, that they will get an honest answer. Your child might ask big questions about the illness, and they may seem really upset one minute, and then they might just run out the door the next and play with their friends. And that's very age appropriate for this kind of 4 to 8 year old group. But I suppose when they're seeking the support, that's when, really to give them that time, which can be difficult. They might I suppose want support at times when it's very busy, but it's doing your best, and that's the main thing. Children can kind of sometimes feel that it's their fault, or that they've somehow caused this, particularly if there's been a busy period over the past couple of months or year. They might think, oh, if I didn't do this or if I didn't do that. So it's important, I suppose, to offer reassurance that this is nobody's fault. This is not something that anybody caused. They may be afraid to give you a hug or a kiss or show affection because they might be afraid to that they might be afraid that they're going to hurt you. But it's important, I suppose, to reassure them that that's not going to happen, and that, modeling that. So maybe hugging another loved one so that they can see, oh, well, Auntie Sheila hugged, Mammy, and they didn't hurt each other, so that'll be fine, for example. And although there's probably, on the flip side of that, you might want nothing more than a hug from your child or grandchild or niece or nephew. Giving them the space to kind of come to terms with it and not putting pressure on them. They might feel a little bit reluctant or fearful. And it's normal for children, I suppose, when there is changes happening with their loved one, to kind of feel a bit fearful and a bit reluctant. So giving them that space to adjust before kind of forcing them, I suppose forcing them is a very strong word, but, putting pressure on them to maybe give, the kisses and the cuddles and things like that, kind of letting them kind of come to terms with it themselves. And when a big deal isn't made of it, that kind of normally kind of settles down and they begin to kind of feel comfortable again. So it's just to give them that space. I suppose the next group then is our teenagers and our preteens. And this is, I suppose, a tricky group in terms that, there's that sense of adulthood about them. They want to be the grown-ups in the house, and they really want to begin to be, I suppose, included in the family conversations. They want to be respected and listened to as a kind of a key person within the family unit. And it's important, I suppose, for us to respect that as well. So at the beginning, they may not want to talk to you about the illness, or they may not know how to talk to you about the illness. They may not know how to express their feelings. And they may just need a little bit of time to adjust to the changes that might be happening. But they will probably ask more questions as time goes on. And a really useful way of starting a conversation with any teenager about any topic is just giving them the opportunity to ask questions. So what exactly would you like to know? And asking a kind of open-ended question like that is really useful, because it gives them control over what information that they're going to get. And it gives them control over, I suppose, to direct the conversation themselves. So instead of us having to take responsibility of where am I going to start with the information, what information am I going to give, by giving them control and letting them ask questions, it can be a really useful way. So I suppose really, and I'll mention it again, but when communicating kind of the diagnosis and the illness to your children or teenagers, it can be important then as well, or it can be really useful to follow up after you've given them some information, follow up with, so what did you take from that? What did you understand from what I've just said? And ask them nearly to repeat back their understanding of it. And that can be really useful, because I might say, the sky is blue, but somebody might take that up very differently. So asking the people that when you tell them the news, what exactly they've taken from that. And especially, I suppose, in a child's brain and in a teenager's brain, things can be picked up in different ways. And they may be afraid to follow up and ask kind of for clarity. So asking them to feedback what they've understood from the conversation can be really useful.
About 4 minutes, please, Sheila.
Perfect. So for teenagers who have already started to move away from family-centred activities, and engage in more kind of peer-related activities, they may not know how to respond. They may not know they may not even know what they're feeling within their bodies in terms of feelings and their thoughts. They may not even be able to identify that. So that can be really tricky. And there's a lot going on at that age group. So having that kind of, giving them that one-to-one regular space is really important, so that they can talk through their fears or anxieties, and that they know you're available and that you're okay to handle their questions and their fears. They can be, I suppose, very overprotective of their loved ones, and they may not want to add to your burden. So you having experienced the diagnosis and going through different, signs and symptoms, they might not want to add to that. So they might be afraid to let you know that they're having fears and worries, and they may be battling that internally. So it can be very useful to, have the space of a healthcare professional. Even counselling through the IMNDA and things like that can be really useful for this age group, so that they have a space to process the emotions that they're feeling. Teenagers can, I suppose, feel a little bit of guilt at times in terms of feeling, well, why does it have to be my loved one? Why does it have to be my parent? Why does it have to be, as that we can all feel? And I suppose it's important that, on the flip side of that, they might feel guilty as a result of those feelings. So having that space to talk to somebody else, talking to somebody outside the family, can be really useful. So I'll just flick on. So just general, I suppose, tips for talking to loved ones of any age. It can be really helpful to check in, making sure that they've understood what they've been told. Creating a space for open and frank conversations can be really helpful. And it can be really useful to include your family and friends in the diagnosis, so that they can help support you. And this can be really, beneficial for everyone's quality of life. Allowing them space to deal with it. So they may need to go away and process the information for a little while, and then creating that space to let them come back. Over the course of the illness, and especially with motor neuron disease, it's an illness of many unanswered questions. And over the course and different stages, more questions will arise. But it's important, I suppose, direct your family and friends to the services that are available. And the IMNDA is a fantastic service that's available to family and friends of people with the illness. And then it's important to recognise that decisions can change from one point to the next. So where I might say right now, I can't talk about this, tomorrow that might be different. So it's allowing people to come back to you, even if they, say, this is not something I'm able to discuss or talk about. The final thing I'm going to say is, you don't have to have all the answers as the person with the illness, or your kind of immediate family or friend, your caregiver, your kind of immediate next of kin say. You don't have to have all the answers. And it's important to, I suppose, acknowledge that it is okay to say to your loved ones, I don't know, but sure, I'll ask at my next clinic visit. I'll ask the IMNDA. And the very last thing I'm going to say is, for family and friends, I cannot highlight or recommend this book enough for, not having all the answers, or maybe not being able to talk about it. Direct them towards this book. It is a fantastic resource. It is a complete guide. It really is. So it's just to, I suppose, highlight that in terms of, it's a great resource for people to have access to, and they can dip in and out of it. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I could talk all day, so.
No, Sheila, you're fine. It was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for that. This is the bit where I do my little Gay Byrne impression. And on that book, there's one for everybody in the audience. They're literally outside the door, so do pick it up. It's a wonderful resource. Everyone gets one. It's great. Okay, so we've time for some questions for Sheila. It's a complicated area, and it's a conversation and a journey many people in this room have been on. And everybody's experience, I think it's fair to say, Sheila, is unique, and unique to them and unique to circumstance, but there are common threads that come through. So if anyone has a question for Sheila or would like to share something, if they could put their hand up now, please, and we'll get a microphone to you. If you can. That's fine. Yeah, we've one at the back of the room there.
I got this.
Go on, mate. Go on. Jess, you made great time there.
Hi. Thank you very much. So we have a 7-year-old daughter. Her name's Una, and we think we have communicated well or given her the narrative of what this is about. But the obstacles that we come across are the children that she meets day to day. And I was wondering if there's any tips that we could be doing to help Una as this gets more real for us, because we're only 4 months in.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point, because it's her journey as well. And you've done the bit in the house, but it's what's outside the walls that worries you. Sheila?
Yeah, that can be really, and I suppose just to clarify, I presume it's the questions or the questions that she might get from her peers in terms of the kids in her class. Yeah, that
So
can be.
her realize this is what she says to adults is, my daddy's not old, my daddy's brain, the nerves don't write messages to his fingers and toes. So that's what she's communicating, but I don't think other 7-year-olds get that. So any tips be welcomed.
Yeah, and I suppose you've communicated in a lovely way to her. Like, I suppose we can get bogged down in a lot of language, but for her, I suppose what's important for her, what comes to my head is what's important for the other kids in her life to know. And that's maybe that I'm not sure how her daddy is affected, but say for example, if it's motor function, so if he's going to be in a wheelchair, my daddy's in a wheelchair because his legs aren't working as well as they used to, and maybe that's enough at that point. And it's not to go into kind of lots of explanations for lots of different people. Maybe it's just supporting Una to say, yeah, my daddy's in a wheelchair, that's okay, that's supporting him to live, and that's enough information for them. I suppose for yourselves, it's it can be difficult to have all the answers for Una, but I suppose, for the peers and stuff, it's just to make sure Una's supported and that she has some sort of thing to say. But, something like that can be enough for the kids, and they'll move on quite quickly.
Yeah, and kids are incredibly resilient despite the challenges that life can throw up, and keep those communication channels open with her. That's the most important thing. Sounds like you're doing a great job already, so well done.
Yeah.
And have we any other questions from the room for Sheila? Okay. Yes, indeed, we go there. Jeez, mate, if you're doing all the running, what's the story with you? No, you don't want to move at all. Frightening. Anyway, go on.
Hi, Noreen here again. I was talking earlier, but we have two smallies, so we have an older girl as well, but when I say small, they're teenagers, preteens, 14 and 12. 14-year-old has 101 questions, and I answered them as best I could. And he will continue to ask questions. The 12-year-old hasn't said a word, just asks where are we going, what time we'll be back at, if I'm disappearing out of the house for whatever reason. But I've tried to open up and kind of get him to open up, but he just hasn't. And he seems to be doing okay at school. I've got the teachers looking out for him. So is there something else I should be doing to try and encourage him to talk, or is it just that age that he just doesn't want, or he's just that type of person doesn't want to know, whereas the other lad has questions morning, noon and night.
101 questions, yeah.
And I think that just goes to show the individuality, even within a family, that one child will have, it's amazing, really. I suppose just to say that if you're, one of the things I was, just as you were talking there, if you're letting him know the different appointments, he might have questions in his head that he's afraid to ask. So even by you letting him know, look, we're heading off to Dublin today for the clinic, but we'll be home there at 5 o'clock. And then if there's any changes to that, if you get delayed, letting them know. So keeping them in the dialogue and open dialogue all the time. You don't need to say exactly what you're going for if you don't want to, it doesn't need to be lots and lots of details, but maybe he's at the stage where he's worrying that you're not telling him something, or, and he's keeping it to himself. So I think what you're doing is really good, in that you're letting them know the story, you're letting them know the plan each day in terms of if there's different things on. And I think that's really important. You don't need to bog them down with loads of information and times and dates and all this kind of stuff, but letting them know, look, we're heading off here today. We should be back for whatever time. If there's any changes, you will know, so that he knows that he's being kept in the loop, and that there's kind of an honesty there as well. But it sounds like you are doing, you're kind of responding to both of their needs. What I would say is, just keep an eye on, I suppose, just because one is asking loads of questions doesn't mean he's processing it differently. So just keep an eye on them. And if it becomes a thing that, they might need both, or either of them might need, to chat to somebody externally, that can always be arranged as well.
Okay, brilliant. Dr. Sile Carney.
Yeah.
Dr. Sile Carney, thank you so much for your time. Sile Carney, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.